question them. And that's the angle. Joining me now is Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and White House Coronavirus Task Force member. All right, Dr. Fauci, Hannity told me, and I got to do what he says, he said that for the nation, and I know you've heard this a lot, but thank you for what you're doing. The time, the energy, the effort that you're putting in, and all the members of the Coronavirus Task Force. This is just, I know because I get to talk to a lot of you guys off camera, and it's a nonstop life that you have and for the foreseeable future. So thank you, sir, for that.
You're very welcome. It's a team effort.
Dr. Fauci, the media seems to enjoy, in this very difficult time, looking for the tension between you and the president. And you gave an interview to Maureen Dowd where you talked about, look, you have a role, the president has his role. But where do things stand right now between you and the president on the timeline and where we are?
It's a back and forth. The president clearly listens. I mean, he has this aspirational goal of hoping that we might be able to do it by a certain date. We talk to him about that. We say we need to be flexible. He realizes that and he accepts that. I mean, he doesn't want to give up his aspirational goal, but he's flexible enough to say, okay, let's look at it on a day-by-day basis. We say, and we will, give him data to inform the decision. The more we learn about what's out there, particularly in areas of the country that don't have the big spikes like New York, and we talk about it. We talk about what that would do to inform our decision. But he's been very flexible about it. Even though it looks like he's made this absolute decision on something, he does have an open mind about it.
Dr. Fauci, the new data that's coming in, I'm sure you've seen the Wuhan study, the study coming out of Lombardy about the ICU admissions. And today, Andrew Cuomo basically said, look, we need 30,000 ventilators. Is that the number, in your estimation, correct, given the new data, and as you extrapolate it out to the United States, out of Wuhan and Lombardy?
Yeah. What I think the governor was saying, I'm pretty sure, is that that's the total amount that he would need. And we'll take him for his word about that. I mean, he's, quite frankly, he's really gotten hit with a really bad situation. And quite frankly, I think he's doing a very good job. When he says 30,000 and he needs it, we'll take him for his word. We obviously want to estimate to see what he already has and what the delta is of what he'll need, as opposed to the totality of the entire period of time over the next couple of months.
But the modeling that was done on, and correct me if I'm wrong, is by the Imperial College and the American Hospital Association, and it was devastatingly frightening. And that was about the peak that we have for ICU beds, the peak for the virus and the ICU beds that we'll need. But again, looking at the Wuhan data, that's the latest data that we have, aren't those new data points that have to be used to inform our decision-making on this critical issue of overwhelming hospitals and how we have to stop that? So it's a long-winded question, but are we updating our modeling, Dr. Fauci, because this is the critical question of overwhelming our system?
Laura, we always do that. We always update the model. But the one thing we have to be really careful about, and I think everybody who's been involved in this, who has experience, knows that models are only as good as the assumptions that you put into the model. And sometimes there's a real great degree of variability with those assumptions. So although we reevaluate the models continually, we've got to be careful that they don't always predict exactly what we'll need. That's just a fact.
But that's a pretty important data point, is it not? Because we're seeing, thankfully, the mortality rate decline as we test more people. And that's still terrible, but it's not perhaps as bad as that 3% and 4% number that was initially forecast. So that number of ICU beds that are needed, that's really one of, or if not one of the most critical questions that are outstanding. And if it's wrong, if the numbers are not right, then maybe that affects the decision making about when the country can gradually get back to business.
You're absolutely right, Laura, and that's exactly right. FEMA is working closely with the state of New York to try and figure out exactly what they'll need at what time. I mean, if the totality is 30,000, what do they need now, next week, the week after? But you're right, those kind of models do help inform us.
And Dr. Fauci, the news, when I was reading these studies today, it's clear that men are more likely to have serious health implications because of this, more likely to get the virus, it looks like, including with hypertension, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, all factoring in the comorbidity rate once people are actually admitted into the hospital, then into the ICU. Any idea of how and why that's happening?
You know, that's a great question. We do not know. I mean, we have to be humble and say, we're really not sure. It's a little bit puzzling. There may be some mitigating factors with men, that they have a greater incidence of some underlying conditions, perhaps high blood pressure, perhaps heart disease, perhaps with smoking and lung disease. We don't know. We don't really know precisely, but there are some hints that they may have some underlying factors that are a bit more than in women.
Yeah, it looks like 57% of the individuals who were admitted into the ICU or critical care in Wuhan were people with these underlying conditions, and a strong majority were men. So that's another thing we'll figure out eventually. But Dr. Fauci, a lot of people are messaging me during the day about hydroxychloroquine and other antivirals that are now being prescribed by treating physicians in the United States and beyond. So if, heaven forbid, something happened to you, you got a positive coronavirus test, and you fell ill, would you feel comfortable taking one of these new antivirals, such as hydroxychloroquine?
You know what I would do, Laura? There are a number of clinical trials. I'm a believer in a clinical trial, because at the same time, I'd want to help myself. I'd want to get an answer as to what really works or not. So I might take one of those drugs, but I would do it within the auspices of a controlled clinical trial. I've always felt that way. And so
you would take one of those drugs because we are getting some positive results. And this is wartime, right? So it's not all buttoned down and controlled. We do what we can do with what we have.
I'm not so sure, Laura, just to clarify, that I would necessarily take one of those drugs. I would take a drug that was on a clinical trial. Some of those drugs that you're mentioning are available within the context of a clinical trial. Those same drugs you can probably get from your physician if they do an off-label use, because they are already approved for other purposes, like malaria and some autoimmune diseases. But myself personally, I like to get some knowledge out of it. So if I had a situation where I needed a drug, I'd look around if there was a clinical trial that would give me access within the contours of a clinical trial.
And Dr. Fauci, Americans want facts and transparency, but they also want hope. So what hope can you give them tonight?
You know, I mean, the hope that I give is that right now, to just hang on as best as you can, just please implement the recommendations of the guidelines to be able to protect yourself and those around you, avoid crowds, do the things that are on that list that we talk about essentially every night. But also know, as time goes by, as we test more drugs, as we get better and better in a vaccine, you know, I told you some time ago that a vaccine is being developed. It still will be quite a while before we have it, but it is conceivable that this may go into another season. And if it does, it will bring us that much closer to the possibility of having not only drugs available, but also a vaccine. So that's the hope for the future.
All right, Dr. Fauci, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on tonight.
Good to be with you, Laura.
All right, and